It's time again for the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast with Dr. John Dentico. The mission of our podcast is to provide 21st century leadership training for a talent-driven world. We help organizations implement strategies and practices designed to attract, hire, engage, and retain top talent while mitigating the effects of burnout. Our guests are experts in various fields of organizational dynamics, including, but not limited to, leadership management, communication, and coaching. They bring a world of knowledge and solutions to our viewers and listeners. I am sincerely grateful for their participation and ideas. What are the characteristics of, and how can you recognize, a toxic workplace? Do you know the 4 dynamic states of psychological capital? Can you define optimism? And are you able to contrast it against being pessimistic? Is there a difference between being happy or being content? If any of these questions interest you, then I am confident my conversation with psychologist Lindsay Tsang, founder of Happy Hires, will provide insights, inspiration, and ways to improve your own mental state. So let's get started. And if you enjoy our podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. We genuinely appreciate your support. Hello again, and welcome to the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. I'm Dr. John Dentico, your host. Today, I am joined by Lindsay Tsang, a trained psychotherapist who focuses on stress management for clients triggered by work in toxic environments. His work centers on a recurring theme: the profound impact of leadership on workplace well-being. At Happy Hires, Lindsay partners with CEOs and owner-operators of small to medium-sized enterprises committed to leadership excellence. Lindsay is in the final stages of a pursuit of his PhD in organizational psychology, specializing in leadership and positive psychology. I am pleased and grateful for his time with me today. Good afternoon, Lindsay. How are you this fine day?
Thanks for having me, John. I am doing well.
Good. Glad to hear it. Lindsay, I have to tell you, one of the things that I focus on is how do we overcome toxic environments? What is that? What does it take to do that? So jumping right in, I'd like to ask you this question. Lindsay, while it may seem obvious to many, okay, from your experience, what would you say are the characteristics of a toxic workplace?
Oh boy. I would say that first off, I'm just trying to think back to my own experiences, right?
Okay.
Because you can always tell when you're under good leadership or when you're under bad leadership. And I would say that when I was under bad leadership, one of the first things that I felt was a lack of trust there. We were starting to see people get laid off for not really great reasons, right? I myself eventually did too, got laid off. And the reasons were really, there was no transparency to how it happened. I had my beliefs about it, but that never came across straight from the leader. I think that in a lack of vision, there was very little ideas of where we were going and why there was this turnover that was happening. That a lot of that led to people talking in the workplace. People were whispering and saying, "What's going on here? Why is this happening?" So, in my opinion, that's a little bit of a toxic culture that's been created by a new leader that came in, right? Yeah, I think that's where I'm going with for now.
Okay. I appreciate that. And that makes perfect sense to me. Let me ask you this question. Let's peel that onion back a little bit more.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we can. I think you've already mentioned some of them, but let's see if we can go a little deeper. So what do you think are the causes of toxic workplaces? That is to say, what is it that causes it to become toxic?
Hmm. I'm thinking about the opposite of some of the things. One of the expertise I have is in servant leadership. So my studies is around this topic. And so when you look at the traits of people who are more likely to have this kind of behavior, they would score lower on things like narcissism. Okay, they would score higher on things like passion, compassion, and love. So it's almost like the opposite of that, right? Would be the traits of the bullying type of leader, right? So there's a higher level of narcissism. In my one of the ways to look at it too, from a framework I'm working with called the prioritized leader model, it could be just a matter of switching of priorities. So, for example, if I prioritize the profitability of the company over that of, say, the pace of the company or the culture, that the positive culture that you want to create in the company, then that would create a very toxic environment as well. So it's just a matter of swapping of the priorities in the wrong order.
Okay, great. So I think what I'm hearing you saying is, and correct me here, I'm
Sure.
completely open, is these hierarchical models of leadership, these hierarchical top-down models of leadership seem to be at odds with the people and their needs in the workplace today. How would you respond to that?
Part of it is contextual, I think. If you want to draw a quadrant out and you have the really highly accountable type of leadership, the ones that are task oriented and has high expectations. And then you have on the other side, we have highly relational kind of leadership. So in the studies in the Western world, what you would see a lot of is that you really want a bit of both, right? You want people who can have high expectations and accountability, but also healthy relationships. And that would create a really empowering kind of culture or leader type of leadership. Funny enough, if you go to some of the Asian countries, for example, studies coming out of there would show you that the high expectation, low relational, which would be the more authoritarian, top-down type of leadership, is where people thrive more. So part of it is culturally based. Some people actually, for example, there was one study I was reading about, and I think this was in Fiji. When one of their leaders start displaying servant leadership, they had a really hard time with it because they were not used to it.
Sure.
So I imagine, and I hope that's more just my idealism, is that if there was a certain leader long enough, they would learn to adapt to that and realize the benefits of it. But that's just my point of view. And it could be very well that some people are just wired in a way through generations to really enjoy having authoritarian type of leadership. So I don't know. That's just an extra piece of uh, nuance there that not a lot of people talk about.
I think it's a great observation. I think that people are used to what they're used to. And we have to understand that cultures, wherever you may be, are different. That in the United States, for example, people strive for freedom and
Yeah.
and to have a say in their own life. One of the things I talk about recently is people want to have an opportunity to involve themselves in the decision-making processes of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
They want to matter. They want to
Yeah.
find meaning from the
Yeah.
work that they do. And it may be different. I'm not saying that people in other cultures don't. It's just their approach and the way they come to it is different. One of the things you've talked about in our pre-work up here, where I normally send a document out and ask you to fill it in. You talked about positive mindsets, excuse me.
Yeah.
So, and I know that's great interest to you. How do you work with clients to make the switch from, let's say, a negative to a positive mindset? What do you do that gets them to say, I really do need to make a change?
Yeah, I think the first piece is actually education because I think a lot of people don't really know what that means. Like, what is a positive mindset, right? And so when you're able to define it, it actually, even in defining it, it makes it easier. The mindsets that I'm touching on is a super construct that's called psychological capital in the scientific world. And have you heard of it before?
I have not heard of that specific term. Why don't you go, please take it and
Yeah,
go with it.
psychological capital is a personal resource. These are states that you can increase or decrease. So they're not traits that are static, they are
Right.
dynamic. And so the four parts to it is having hope, having efficacy, which is confidence, having resilience, and optimism. And when you tie the four together, you find what the studies have found is that they are a stronger predictor than just when you take one by itself of all sorts of positive outcomes in the organization, like higher job satisfaction, employee engagement, lower turnover, all sorts of things. what's great about all four of these things is that they're developable. So when you put interventions behind them, you can actually train someone to become more hopeful or more confident or more resilient or more optimism. I'm thinking of a client I've seen once who I explained these four constructs to him. And he said, okay, hope, confidence, resilience, no problem. I got it in spades. He says, but optimism, I don't know about that. How can you change that for me? I'm a pessimistic person, right? And so I gave him the definition of optimism, and it completely changed his mind. He said this was worth the session in gold, just right here. when when I give it to him. So I'll give you I'll give it to you guys, the listener, because I think it's pretty helpful. Optimism, the definition, the at least the scientific definition of it is someone who scores high would see negative events as mostly temporary and mostly localized. Whereas someone who is pessimistic or low in optimism would see negative events as pervasive and permanent. Okay. And the opposite is true of positive attributions or beliefs about themselves, for example. So they would see someone who's optimistic would see positive beliefs about themselves to be generally just true. Someone who's pessimistic instead would see those as by chance or luck, right? But when you know that the definition, it's easier to now change that because you can start asking yourself, when I think about these negative beliefs, how pervasive am I making it? How permanent am I making it? Right? You can challenge those. And so that's how you can, that's what I mean by defining it and then using those exercises to help switch the mindset. And of course, that needs to happen in all these different contexts, right? Within your work, within your family, whatever it is. If I'm feeling I might feel optimistic about some things and pessimistic about other things, right? Mm-hmm. So you can use the same kind of tools to switch that mindset over.
You just made this podcast very valuable. I think I have never quite heard it expressed clearly and brilliantly. That is really gold. It is gold. And what it keys in my mind is how the definition of being perennially pessimistic leads to depression and the ongoing state of feeling as though you're out of control. I will tell you honestly, my definition of depression, having dealt with it for several bouts in my own life, is that it's anger turned inward. That you feel as though you don't have control, you've lost control, and no matter what you do, you cannot exercise control.
Yeah.
And I think to me that when you can exercise control, even if it's going for a walk, even when it's going for a jog or something like that, all of a sudden you're taking back the control in your life. And I think that puts you in a much better position to think optimistically than carrying on in a very pessimistic way. That's really terrific. I really appreciate that. Let me ask you another question here. There's no doubt in the aftermath of the pandemic, work has changed dramatically to a much more hybrid mix. How we choose to use that hybrid mix, I think organizations are still trying to work that out.
Yeah.
What do you think are the greatest challenges for people who spend a significant amount of time working from a home office, let's say?
Oh, I think the biggest challenge is actually our identification with the work. Here's a good visual, right? There's a particular survey on job identification where they would use two circles to signify the individual and the organization. And then they would have those two circles go closer and closer until they overlap. And that's one way of someone measuring how closely they identify with their workplaces. And along with that comes a lot of studies on the benefits, or it could be deficits too, but benefits of having a high personal identification to your work. And that usually means that people are more engaged, people are enjoying the work more, which also leads to other positive outcomes. So I think that it's not impossible. Like I have a friend who's doing his job completely remote right now, but his company has done a really great job of keeping tabs on people and having group meetings. and they would once a month get together to go through some trainings and lunches. And so it was for him, he's so dedicated to this company right now because they've given him the best of both worlds. They still have that identity, the cultural identity attachment to the company and friendships that are being flourished there. But at the same time, he has all the flexibility of not having to commute and being able to do his job in a very autonomous, flexible kind of way.
One of the things that I ask my guests about is the hybrid workplace because it's on the minds of everybody. And I
Yeah.
think that was a great comment you made about this ability to do something useful with the time that people spend in their brick and mortar, if you will, places, training, lunch. You can do meetings with Zoom, as we both know.
Yeah.
So, do you want to meeting people to death when they come into the door? And I don't know if you want to do that. You got to give them something meaningful that matters to them in as they attend their brick and mortar place. So let me ask this question because it's you're keying things in me, and I want to ask you this. I'm a devotee of Viktor Frankl and his concepts of man's search for meaning and how
Yeah.
people create meaning in life and the importance of meaning in life.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this from your background and your studies, and how important do you think meaning is for people today?
It's everything, isn't it? Right. Back to the prioritized leader model, purpose is number one. You've got to have it number one. I've heard this kind of story before. I think this connects to this. So the story, it might be from Viktor Frankl actually, but so the idea is that you have two men in jail, and on the other side of jail, there's $1 million waiting for them. But one of them knows it and the other doesn't. So the realities are exactly the same, but the subjective reality of the man who knows it is going to be highly different than the one who doesn't know it, right? And so I think that when it's and that's an analogy to say if you know what the vision is, the end goal is that captivates you, it's completely different than if you don't and you're just there and coasting.
Yeah, I agree. I think what Frankl does is he offers hope to
Mm.
people in the sense that you can lift yourself out of whatever state you're in a manner of speaking, if you have a sense of purpose about your life, if you're willing to go for something, even if it's difficult to do, this becomes the driving force
Yeah.
of meaning is so important.
Yeah.
I think you've already done this, but let me ask you, see if you've got another example. I wanted to see if you could provide, without naming names here, a client experience, something you've talked about that, I think already, but if you have another one, I'd really appreciate knowing that where you saw a problem, maybe someone's working in a toxic environment, a toxic workplace, and you made an inroad with this individual, perhaps an intervention, and I'd like to know what you did and how things worked themselves out. What was the outcome? If you can
Mm.
think of another example,
Yeah.
because I think the example that you gave with the definition was terrific. Just understanding the definition. I think definitions are important. I think
Yeah.
we don't do enough with definitions because they encompass things. They tell us what this is and what this isn't, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'll give you another definition, right? So if the psychological definition of hope is knowing your end goal and knowing your goal path towards it. And so that's actually a really applicable thing when you have a client coming in and they're saying, I'm feeling a little bit lost. And you'll say, okay, what's the vision? I don't know. That's why you're feeling hopeless.
Right.
Like right away, we know, right? So
Right.
it goes right back down to then what's the outcome you're looking for, right? We have to really drive that home before we can do any other homework to move towards it. So there's a lot of examples of that. A client I'm thinking of who they're just having a hard time getting a particular employee to do what they want them to do. And so we had to work hard on what's the final outcome we want for that first. And then we moved backwards on then what's the steps we need to do to move towards that. So it's an art and a science, right? So there's certain processes that I might have learned But I try not to impose that until they really feel lost, and then we can talk about it. But a lot of times people, because they are the experts of their own context, if you just ask them sharp enough questions, eventually they get it. So that would be the coaching way of helping someone get from A to B, right?
Let me just ask you a question. Just again, it occurred to me. If you were to step back from the things that you've done, if you were to step back and look at the landscape of organizations that you've worked in or worked with, and you had to assign, let's just say a percentage, a rough percentage, how many of the organizations that you've worked with, and maybe this is just, maybe it's too hard because you're called in to work with folks who are having issues and problems, but in your opinion, how many of those organizations do you think create toxic environments as opposed to how many would you say are doing well? They create the proper kind of organization. My typical one-liner is, creating an environment where people come to
Mm.
do their best work every single day.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you, can you contrast those in any level of percentage or anything like that?
That would be hard for me to do because, like you said, usually if people coming to me for problems, it's because it's not going that well. So I have a skewed view of what's out there. But you can just take a look at some studies, right? I would something like it's a pretty high amount. 60 or 70% of employees are not engaged. 63, I believe, is the number from Gallup surveys. And a pretty high number of people don't even know, they can't even tell you what the mission or vision of their company is. And so then that there's some companies who they might have a really great document about it, but they don't communicate it very well or often enough for there to be the excitement or buy-in into it.
They don't live it. They talk a great game, but when it comes to actually living it, either they don't know how to do it, which
Yeah.
is probably a percentage, a good percentage of it, or they just are so driven by numbers that the
Mm-hmm.
people that we will find new people. That's the old methodology of thinking it. We'll get the people in the door. Don't worry about it. We'll find new people. I have a presentation now called "The Talent Wars Are Over. The Talent Won."
Mm.
And everywhere I go, in the presentations I've done in the last 6 months in different spots of the country for different types of organizations, it's always the same problem.
Mm.
It's we can't find good people who want to
Yeah.
stay with the organization
Mm-hmm.
and do the work,
Right.
even if that means doing very hard or difficult work. And
Mm.
they just can't keep it's retention. You can attract the people, but trying to
Yeah.
keep your hands on them is and keeping them in the organization has become a very difficult task. In a previous podcast, I had a guest by the name of Jimmy Burrows,
Mm.
who's wrote a book called Beat Burnout and Ignite Performance. And
Mm.
he told me something in our podcast that I said, wow, that's a profound observation. And it was that when we talk about burnout, we're not talking about individual burnout anymore. We're really
Mm.
talking about the organization being burned out.
Yeah.
And signs of that are things like high attrition. That's a clear sign that people want to get off. Hey, let me out of here. I can't
Yeah.
do this thing. I don't know. Do you see that? That's very interesting. Do you see that too in your work?
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about my study. What I did was a survey for Canadian doctors and nurses. We had about 678 valid responses to the study. And this is what I discovered, right? My study is based on how they perceive their supervisors. Are they servant leaders or not? And then how they perceive their own states, the positive states we mentioned already. And how does that in turn affect their turnover intentions? So how intent are they for leaving their organizations? So we can see there that there's a correlation. There's actually a direction of the servant leadership increases people's personal psychological capital, which decreases then their turnover intentions. Now, I use this population in general, in specific, because anecdotally, I know a lot of people in healthcare are really suffering. And they've been suffering long before COVID, and it just made it much worse during COVID. So the majority of my respondents were younger nurses. And 46% of them indicated they want to leave the organizations. That's a lot, right?
That's a lot.
And yeah, and it's in line with headlines. I'm seeing it in the headlines like, oh yeah, 40% of nurses want to leave. So when you look into some of the studies in the same context, some of it came back down to bullying culture for one of the reasons why they want to leave. For these young workers coming in. Yes, the landscape is that context to context, but in this particular landscape, is that there's some very old school style thinking of leadership, and that is causing a really hard time for retention.
I have to agree with you. I'm speaking to the North Carolina Nurse Practitioners Spring Symposium in about 3 weeks, and burnout, and people just, and the funny part is they talk about wages and money and different things like that. And it's obvious to me that money's not going to fix this. You could give more money. And there's an old study that says that 6 months after people get a 10% raise, they want 10% more. So money's not going to fix this. But what you're saying is exactly what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Exactly what I'm seeing. So let me just ask you our final question. And that is if you could wave a magic wand against over a particular problem and make it go away, what would that problem be, and why would it be? Why did you choose that problem?
Yeah, I work with CEOs, right? I work with the leaders, the usually they're owners of their company, small 10 to 200 employees. And so I'm helping them, right? Happy hires came out of this desire to help make better leadership because then people are happier and more effective in their workplaces, right? Um, so that as a huge magic wand would be workplaces would be awesome. But yeah, so I'm but the best people to help get that outcome are the leaders. And if I can get leaders to learn how to be a happy leader themselves, then they're going to be able to have that change agent, be that change agent for their workplaces.
Great. Lindsay, listen, thank you so very much for being here with me today on the Throttle Up Leadership Podcast. I truly appreciate it. I think this is one of the best podcasts I've ever done. And a lot of it, and most of it is your doing. So I greatly appreciate it. I think there's such tremendous information in here on using definitions, for example, and the psychological capital is just, it's just terrific. So thank you so very much for your time and effort today. And I want to thank all my viewers and listeners for showing up and listening to and watching the Throttle Up Leadership podcast. And as I like to say, remember, leadership is what people do together. So thank you so very much.